what social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, where someone does something strange, we immediately jump to thinking like, what was it about that specific individual that led them to do that, rather than thinking about the systems and so on that were shaping them.
You're listening to Good is in the Details. I'm Gwendolyn Dolske.
And I'm Rudy Salo.
And this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, all with the aim of a happy life. And today, we have two guests, both fabulous. But I just want to say one of the guests also work with him in the philosophy department at Cal Poly. So Dr. Alex Madva and Dr. Daniel Kelly of Purdue University. They co-wrote a book called Somebody Should Do Something. These philosophers got together to iron out ideas of ways in which we can address existing problems, ways in which addressing them has not worked, and how can we move forward and why is it important. So one of the big ideas in the book is that there are big structural issues, but they have been tackled on an individual level. And so this book is about addressing the structural issue, not saying the individual responsibility isn't important. It's not an either or. It's just that more needs to be done. Like the example, I think one time in one of our episodes, you brought up something about recycling, like how we make every single person almost feel bad if they're not recycling and everybody has to be recycling. And yet that's not going to solve the environmental issues.
Yeah.
We put it on each other.
Yeah, as I've gotten to know the recycling industry even a little bit more, I've even learned that like what we think we're doing with recycling, it's not actually going to the right place. It's not actually being correctly done. You have to find like real experts. You have to hire outside companies. That's one of the structural things that we're talking about here.
Yes.
This episode's important because the philosophical tenets that we discuss here address the power of the individual versus the power of the collective, right? The United States is a country that's founded on individual rights. It champions individual rights. At the same time, we have these systems set up where it's like, well, if you want to try to make a change, you do it as an individual and it's not impactful because you're just one individual. And so it's that tension of, well, do we promote individualism? Do we want to do something that's more collective? And that's at tension in the United States, in our foundations of our government. And I think we touch upon that in this episode. The day that we recorded is pretty amazing. Didn't Alex get his piece?
Oh, yes, in the New York Times.
In the New York Times. Pretty incredible,
Yes. I'll be sure to link that in the show notes. Yeah, this idea of structural change, I can't stop thinking about it because I've been thinking about just in terms of education, of how things have shifted to everything is an e-reader and everything is online. And I decided this semester that I was going to go back to students reading hard copies. And at every turn, Rudy, I am turned down at the university because the university stopped providing the resources for physical copies of things. And so now we've got this education problem where people are not reading, and I don't even have the infrastructure to help me to kind of restore it. I'm on my own. So I'm seeing in real time what happens when the infrastructure itself changes. And this reminds me of your wheelhouse when it comes to law. Sometimes the culture isn't ready, but there's a legal shift. And that legal shift then creates a cultural change. So we talk in this episode a little bit with the issue of smoking. You just don't have as many smokers anymore. It's not eliminated, but legally started to restrict the places in which one could smoke, age restrictions, and that legal change then filtered into cultural shifts and created a cultural attitude about smoking. I thought these examples were really, really interesting, or even the seatbelt laws. You and I, we get into the car and don't even think twice about putting our seatbelt on, but it's because we existed within that law. But before that, it was considered a violation of personal rights and personal space for the law to impose seatbelts.
That's
but
right.
Once you have that structure, once you have that legal thing, then people start to shift. And now we look at somebody who's not putting on their seatbelt, like, what is wrong with you?
Yeah, no, that's right. And traffic deaths used to be much higher, in the 50s and 60s. They used to be in the 40s and 50,000s. People, Ralph Nader and his Nader's Raiders came down on it, got laws changed, got the companies to put seatbelts in, made it a requirement that seatbelts actually be in the the car. And then Gwen, if you remember, when we were kids in the 80s and 90s, seatbelt laws were put into place. Like prior to that, like I don't remember putting on a seatbelt very often. Sorry, mom and dad. Yeah, I'm not trying to throw you on the bus. But once the law went into place, definitely the habit came after that.
Yeah. Every day, like when I'm looking at the news or something along those lines, I'm examining how legal shifts are kind of instructing our cultural values. And so this is a great book because it's written by philosophers, but it's not this heavy academic text. It is really put together so that people who would like to participate in the world, make the world a better place, it's giving them the critical thinking behind the problem so that we have a real understanding of the cause and then offers solutions, because the solutions won't work unless we understand the cause. You know, it'd be like you go to the doctor and you say, I'm sick. The doctor cannot prescribe anything for you, cannot offer a solution unless they get to the cause of the illness. In the same vein, Alex and Dan are offering an understanding of the causes of problems so that we can move forward with solutions.
So what are we going to call this one, Gwen? What's
gosh.
what's the title on this one? I like the title of their book, but I don't know if that really speaks well. That sounds a little bit too paranoid.
The individual and structural change, individual change versus structural change, or something.
Nah, I wouldn't use structural. Don't do that. It's too legalese. It's too academic. It's too foofy.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. What about the power and weakness of the individual? I don't know. It sounds a little lofty, but it sounds like somebody might click on that because, they think it's a real self-help episode. So we might be able to pull the rug on people at the same time, which is always fun. No, not a good idea. Okay.
Hey,
there's got to be something about individual, the strength. I don't know, the strength and weakness of individual action.
Oh, right. Yes, Rudy. And you know what you did, like the anger economy last time? I mean, spot on. That was so good.
Thank you. Yeah, I've gotten a couple of text messages from friends and family on that point about the whole anger economy. And they're like, wow, definitely seeing this happening. We're talking about other podcasts, we're talking about it this way, but the way you guys have posited this really opened my eyes. So yes, everything comes down to dollars and cents, baby. Dollars and cents. It's all about the money.
Let's talk about it. Somebody should do something. How? What? With Alex and Dan. Alex and Dan, welcome to Good is in the Details. The beginning of your book brought back a lot of memories. The examples of individual responsibility, the idea of Smokey the Bear saying only you can stop forest fires. Wait, what was another one? I thought, oh my goodness. You didn't mention this, but even Nancy Reagan's campaign of saying no to drugs. I remember watching a Punky Brewster episode and it was like the marching in the street, but nobody addressed why we have to say no to it in the first place. Like, how is it that it's even present or accessible, and more so in other areas? Or why are more people being arrested for it who fit a demographic than another? So that's not addressed. Or even like saying no to litter or pollution. Nobody's addressing how did it get to be an issue in the first place. So it just almost seems like the solution doesn't match the problem because they haven't identified the cause. So it'd be like, going to the mechanic and saying, I need help with the car. And then they can't help the car unless they know exactly what is causing the malfunction. Otherwise, it's useless. So it seems like we've been in this situation of coming up with solutions that aren't actually addressing the root cause. And that's what's interesting, because you've got two major issues here that you're framing when it comes to racism and then climate change. So maybe you can talk about how do these two topics that involve different kinds of sciences and research, what is the central framework that makes them similar? Everyday problems. Wait, was it every person problem? Is that how you say
Everything
it?
problem.
Everything
problem. Okay.
Yeah.
Should I edit that out?
I like
Everything
it.
problem. Okay. All right. What do those two things have in common?
Real quick before we dive into that, I also want to say, in part of what you were just saying, so I 100% agree that in many cases, we are kind of wasting our efforts because we haven't correctly identified the underlying problem. And so we focus on, like in the case of just say no to drugs, we focus on that because we think the problem is just individual willpower. We just have to persuade individuals to resist peer pressure and just give individuals techniques, and we haven't diagnosed the real problem. But I think with many of these social problems, it depends on who we is when we talk about whether we understand the problem. In many cases, people did know the underlying problem, but powerful politicians and corporations who knew what the problems were started big mass media campaigns to prevent the rest of us from understanding the problem. And I think in both the cases of climate change and racism, and probably also in the case of the war on drugs, I think that was also at play. If we wanted to talk about the war on drugs, we could talk about the efforts of the United States to destabilize regions in South America, which then became many of the sources for the drugs that we imported. Or if we're talking about the current opioid crisis, we could talk about what's the name of the Sackler family and OxyContin, and folks who knew very well that they basically just had another narcotic, but they marketed it as this is a totally safe drug. It's not going to be habit forming. They told all the doctors you should prescribe this to your patients. And then we have the opioid crisis, right? In many of these cases, there's a disconnect between powerful actors who do know what the problem is and the message that they're sending to us. But I'll hand it over to Dan to talk more about why we focused on climate change and racism in particular.
Dan, can I throw something out there real fast? Just listening to Alex, that would be in conjunction. Is this an American issue? Because we have a corporate structure and we also have this cultural sense of individual and take care of yourself. Is that part of it is also, American?
Yeah, that's a great question. To some extent, I think there's aspects of both of these problems, the ones that we focus on, racism and climate change, which are distinctively American, but I think there's aspects which are probably more global as well, including the way that we're approaching those problems and the set of concepts we're building up to help people think about them. So the way that we ended up focusing on systemic racism and climate change, there's a bit of an autobiographical element there. Originally, our research and the way the three of us met was that we were all philosophers who were interested in psychological sources of bias, and we met at a conference and we were working on the same stuff originally, particularly with respect to racial biases or biases about sexism and ageism. And we wrote some things there and got a response from other people in the academy, which was basically the individual stuff is so small and negligible. The kinds of biases that you're focusing on that are housed in individual people's minds, they're so insignificant that spending this much attention on them is distracting. It might even be detrimental to the cause. These are problems that are huge, they're systemic, they're culture-wide, they're woven through our social structures. That's the level at which we should be focusing. Individually and then collectively, our response there was, well, we never said that stuff wasn't important. We think that the individual elements that we're focusing on right now connect up in ways which are interesting and would be fruitful to explore with the larger level structural and institutional stuff. And then each of us had interests in climate change before. I designed a class on the moral psychology of climate change. Michael's bar mitzvah theme was climate-based. And so that kind of came in later as a focal point of our collaboration. And we just chose those two because we started studying more the kind of response we got to our initial work on racial bias, that this kind of back and forth debate between what's more important, the individual agency or the structural factors, which one's more important and where the locus of change needs to be focused, that appears everywhere. These are big, huge, sprawling problems, but that kind of debate or that tension between which one we should be directing our efforts at, the individual or the structural level, that just recurs basically in every debate you could have about a social issue. So we didn't want to write a book that was about every social issue there is, and we didn't want to write one that was so abstract that it was just about social change in some, super highfalutin, non-concrete way. So we just took those two issues, climate change and systemic racism, because we knew about them a little bit. We were already invested in them. They seemed clear examples of the kind of points we wanted to make, but we could tell much more concrete stories and draw on much more concrete research to make the point and to build up the set of concepts which allowed us and our readers, hopefully, to see the interconnections between those two things and see points of intervention that they could usefully direct their efforts at to, help make a difference.
I also wanted to circle back briefly to the question about the extent to which this is an American problem. And I think yes and no. So back in, I think, 2021, Freakonomics, not a podcast nowhere near as good as yours, but still okay, did a whole series.
Did you hear that, Rudy?
I did. And that was very, very, very nice. And it's very nice in that I actually love Freakonomics. And I love that when you go to Apple Podcasts and you click on Freakonomics or you look at our podcast, they say more podcasts like this.
Oh, nice.
That's
awesome.
extremely, extremely nice. nice of you guys.
Okay.
Thank you.
So in 2021, they did a series on American individualism, and they make an incredibly compelling case that the current US is the most individualistic country in the history of the planet. In that sense, it is a distinctively American problem. You folks have, for example, done episodes on Captain America, right? And so, like, who is Captain America? He is the individual who will stand up for what's right, his personal individual conviction about what's right, even if the government goes the other way. He has his interpersonal conviction. I love Captain America, don't get me wrong, but he's Captain America because he is the ultimate individual, right? Of course, he's not individualistic in the sense that he's fighting for a broader sense of justice and not just out looking for himself, but he is individualistic in the sense that he is the picture of self-reliance and has the courage of his convictions. But of course, one of the interesting things about someone like Captain America is that he is an incredibly powerful export product from the United States. Like, the US makes money from the rest of the world off of Captain America. Although it is an American problem, we are exporting it to the rest of the world. Of course, it has, roots in European traditions, but we are broadcasting a view about individualism that is, becoming increasingly global. On the flip side of that, when we try to push against a certain kind of individualism, we're not completely opposed to individualism. We do think there's all sorts of important ways in which individuals do need to take personal responsibility, although in many cases we focus on taking responsibility for being there for other people rather than just taking responsibility for pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. We talk a lot in the book about the social science that we think informs a view of individuals as interconnected and social beings. But we also note that while there's been a lot of important social science about this in the last 20, 30, 50 years, coming from a kind of Western context, there are all sorts of other global traditions that have been espousing this view of ourselves as interconnected and pushing against individualism for a long time. So there's lots of indigenous traditions and Confucian traditions and feminist traditions or ecological traditions that have been arguing against that kind of individualism. In many cases, those different views of the individual as fundamentally embedded in a community and shaped by social norms, influenced by other people and influencing in turn, you do find evidence for that view across all sorts of traditions outside of the US.
Another thing that struck me in your book is the duality, and it made me wonder if that was also an American idea, that we're constantly presented with two options. So it's like you're Democrat or Republican. After 9/11, Bush said, you're either for us or you're either with us or you're against us. Some version of that. We constantly have either or this or that. I guess what I was thinking about is that when I look back at structural changes like what you spoke of and how the attitudes that followed, that I can see how it happened. But I'm wondering if right now, when you're in it, it's hard to know that it's possible to be something else. Unless, let's say, you travel outside of the country and then you see there's another way to do things. For example, from your book, I was thinking about another structural change that you mentioned in passing, but it was smoking. And if you look at, let's see, an episode of I Love Lucy, there's a scene where she is pregnant and the doctor is doing a visit and he's smoking in front of her and she's visibly pregnant. That would be a moral outrage right now. And how did it shift? Well, gradually you have warning labels, you have testing, and then you eliminate it from indoor spaces. And then you eliminate it from outdoor spaces. When there's not a place to do this activity, then it did diminish. It doesn't eliminate it, but that structural change gave us a whole attitude about secondhand smoke, that it's not just somebody's choice, but that you're actually interfering with somebody else's well-being. And that took so long. But I'm wondering if right now it's hard to imagine a structural change because the structure creates an idea of normalcy that you don't even see that it's not normal. I'm getting a head nod, but I want to know because I'm just thinking, like, just from traveling, something as simple as the imaginary space that an American has, that you don't realize how bizarre that is until you go outside of North America and you realize that people will stand right next to you. We would consider that to be rude and an invasion. Somebody outside of the country would look at it as, we're the bizarre ones. We're really strange. What do you mean you need 3 feet of space before I can come near you? How do you know that something doesn't have to be if the structure is already dictated that it's the norm?
Yeah, two ideas. It's a great question. Two sort of core ideas that we talk about in the book that I think speak to different parts of it are the idea of social norms and those as a kind of entity which are both sort of obstacles to social change because they're durable and they can be recalcitrant. And sometimes you don't even notice them until you see a deviation from them. But also the one I'll talk about first is the idea of social tipping points. So when you began asking that question, you made a nice point that sometimes we forget that we can change, or when we're in the midst of a certain kind of normalcy, we have no idea how far or close we are to certain kinds of big scale social changes. Like you said, the changes in the norms that surround smoking or the norms surrounding child rearing as another good example of this that have just had a big shift over the last couple of decades. One of the points we make in the book, we have an entire chapter on it, is that change can a lot of times be slow and gradual, and then it can be really drastic. So it's not continuous all the time. And from the inside, we often don't know how far away we are from one of these tipping points where things, maybe slow changes that you don't even notice. And then all of a sudden, ooh, there was a big change and now no one smokes anymore. You don't see cigarettes on TV anymore. You have to, here at Purdue, you have to smoke, I think it's like 30 feet away from any of the buildings on campus at this point. So these shifts in norms then oftentimes get reflected into more formal policies and laws. But a lot of times what builds up to those is these slow and then all of a sudden jumpy changes in social norms. And we also have a chapter on social norms, which are, you can think of them as kind of the unwritten rules of social life. They're not full-on explicit laws yet. They're not formal policies and institutions, but they're these kind of rules that regulate how we interact with each other, how far away you should stand from someone, how you should take turns in the course of a conversation, what kind of clothing is appropriate to wear in different settings. That's a kind of feature of the social fabric, which is easy to miss. It's easy to underestimate the importance of, but it's also part of what locks in our sense of the way things typically or normally happen. But it is actually quite malleable, and the best way to point out the ways in which what's normal isn't the ways that it needs to be. I mean, I think traveling is one great way, but an important first step in a lot of that is making explicit that these norms are in fact part of what govern the way our interactions happen, like calling them to our attention, making sure that people understand that this is just one rule that they're following, often on autopilot. It's the water that we swim through, but often don't even understand is there. But then we can, in fact, change those as well.
Yeah, I was actually going to mention at the end of all of my intro classes, I teach David Foster Wallace's This is Water commencement speech, which begins with the anecdote of there's these two young fish walking along, and then an older fish walks by and says, "How's the water, boys?" And then they keep going. And then one of them turns to the other and says, "What the hell is water?" Right? Because it's just part of the background that we take for granted. And of course, that speech is kind of like a intro level phenomenology existentialism piece. And my own philosophical development about this stuff kind of went through phenomenology and folks like Hubert Dreyfus, who talked about the background and just everything that we take for granted and how much of our lives is shaped by these things that we don't explicitly pay attention to. We build up all these habits so that we can just move through the world in a kind of seamless way, in the flow, in the zone, and then focus on whatever our particular challenge is in any given case. I think that phenomenon, it's sort of essential to being a human. It's essential to getting by in the world, but it has this really troubling side effect, which is that it turns our attention away from the structures that are shaping our lives and just focuses us on each other as individuals. I think there's a cultural element to this. Like in the US, we're particularly primed to focus on individuals. When something bad happens, we want to know who is to blame. And other cultures might have a more collectivist focus or a more communal focus and be looking at other features of the situation. But there's also some reason to think that it's a kind of deep psychological tendency. So what social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, where when someone does something strange, we immediately jump to thinking like, what was it about that specific individual that led them to do that, rather than thinking about the systems and so on that were shaping them. But I think part of the good news of the book is that there's lots of evidence and reason to believe that those tendencies are malleable, that we can build up habits to start paying more attention to the systems that shape our lives.
I'm going to ask a question to someone that might be really out there, right? And the discussions here about social norms, teaching how to navigate the world, what's quote unquote normal. And I'm going to tie that to something, which is that there is a, I don't know, 1,000-fold increase in the levels of what's considered autism, right? An autism spectrum disorder in the last 50, 60, whatever years. What I am trying to tie into here is, yes, of course, there's something's got to be going on, right? It's air pollution, whatever you believe, all those things and all that other type of stuff. But isn't it also the case where the umbrella, and now it's A is D, right? Everything is just under this. The umbrella has gotten larger. The umbrella has gotten bigger. And for those individuals that if things like you're walking by something and it's water, right? For those 2 or 3 people, but that one person's like, what's water? For those individuals that it's not so easy and intuitive and natural to see what the norms are, I feel like that umbrella kind of does explain that. And in a good way, because the expansion of that definition, we are able to better identify individuals that might need that help to navigate society better. I mean, and I suppose a counter argument is that like, well, no, everyone should be an individual and everybody should be their individual selves. And it's like, well, no, there's like norms, and then there's your personal desires, your personal beliefs, the ones that don't hurt people or overly annoy people in society, et cetera, et cetera. And some people need extra help. And that's where, like, as we're expanding that definition, when we're trying to help individuals become better members of society, like, isn't that a good example of where, okay, yes, we're all about the individuals in the United States, but we're also about helping individuals better succeed in our society. And I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that with respect to the research and everything that we're talking about here.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And I definitely, just to start off, I wouldn't we talk about the United States, but of course the US is not a monolith. And so there's all kinds of different competing forces. And there are all sorts of folks who are more communal and less communal and more individualistic and less individualistic. And there's all sorts of, we try to profile positive examples of change in the book. But the kind of looping effects you're talking about are some of the exact phenomena that really preoccupy us in the book. We don't talk about the case of autism specifically. I'm definitely not an expert on it. So nothing that I'm about to say should be interpreted as clinical advice or anything like that. But one of the philosophers that inspired us in the book is Iris Murdoch, who once said, probably going to butcher the quote a little bit, but man is the kind of being who creates a picture of himself and then comes to resemble that picture. Where we come up with these identities, we create labels for things, we create ways of understanding ourselves, and then those labels can themselves proliferate and then they can shape us in turn. And so there's all kinds of labels. I know you talked in the podcast, for example, about introverts, and it's like you might have thought that you were just a weirdo at work or something like that, but then you've got a label, introvert, and you realize I'm not alone. This is a way of being in the world. There are other people who are like me. I'm not deviant. There's nothing wrong with me. This is just my way of being in the world.
Gwen, you're okay. You're okay.
I knew a joke was going to be there. I knew it.
It's not a joke. This is a therapy session. Alex and Daniel and I were talking on the side where this is an intervention. Sorry, Alex, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please go on.
I feel seen. I feel seen and picked on. Like, how did all of a sudden I feel better about myself? And Rudy swoops in and is like, "Why don't you sleep? You can go outside." Okay,
right.
I'm normal.
Yeah, you are kind, you are smart, and doggone it, people like you, even though you're introverted.
Good.
Yeah.
SNL.
So definitely, if you're talking about clinical disorders or clinical ways of being in the world, I mean, we talk about identity processes in general in the book. We talk about cases that we're not as excited about, such as building up an NRA gun identity. That has also been a really powerful social force, whether you like it or not, but it's a really powerful example of like identifying as a member of the NRA, identifying as a gun rights person. Whatever you think about that case, it's a very powerful example of this. But then if you're thinking about some of the clinical cases, then it's not just that you feel seen, you feel okay with yourself, you feel a sense of identity, you feel a sense of community, but it also, as you were saying, allows opportunities for intervention. And so if someone is diagnosed with autism, hopefully, the sooner the better, then we are studying treatments for things that they can work on, such as children can sort of, learn habits for paying attention to people's gaze and things like that. And Temple Grandin is an exceptional person in lots of ways, but she's written about, even though she sort of didn't have automatically some of the same habits that a lot of other people have, she was able to kind of learn them in a certain way, right? And so that was partly through coming to understand herself as autistic, coming to understand herself as having a certain identity. And then that that can shape how we act in turn. So those kinds of looping effects we think are really fundamental for understanding social change, for better or for worse.
And my last question will actually tie into my next question, without calling out any individuals per se. Let's bring it home to transportation and identity and individuals. We have an individual who was absolutely instrumental in trying to move things towards electrification of vehicles. Okay. Without that individual doing what he did, whatever you care about, whatever you think about him or not, whether you're on his team right now or you're putting stuff on your car saying you're not a part of his team so your car doesn't get destroyed.
Is this a ketamine enthusiast?
We don't say names.
Never mind. Okay. All right. We're not saying I just want to know, I just want to
Does
make
he
sure.
invest in Dogecoin? Does he invest in Dogecoin?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know. But we all know
your point's a good one. I know where you're going.
You could go where my question was and then figure things out. Now, I don't know, and I haven't read the books about him, and maybe I should. I don't know if his reasoning per se in going all in on Tesla. I mean, he didn't invent Tesla, right? He bought a company and took some money from wherever he made some money in that last company and invested in some people and then took it to the next step. But it was absolutely instrumental in the electrification of vehicles. Fantastic, right? I love that because it helps out with climate change, right? And you might think, well, I have an electric car, I'm doing my part. But I've argued for a long time that electric car is great. It assists in the climate change equation a little bit. However, if you're just replacing one car on the road with another car, and that car is even heavier and damaging the road, et cetera, and technically those cars are probably not paying their fair share because the vast majority of our infrastructure is financed through the fuel taxes, although we're trying to come up with alternatives. In fact, you might even be causing some other types of environmental damage because you're damaging the infrastructure even more and not paying your quote unquote fair share in any way, shape, or form. And maybe people don't even associate those two of what they're actually doing. They feel good about themselves because they have the electric car, but they don't listen to me. They don't listen to my writings. They don't understand that when you're talking about transportation and you're talking about individual impact, I love what you have in your book about one person might want to ride a bike or use public transit, but I mean, that's just that one person. That one person has to put in that extra effort. That one person needs to educate themselves. That we don't make things so easy for that individual. That's where, like, as a society, what we need to do is set up the infrastructure better for people to make those choices. Our roads are not set up properly, safely for riding bikes. E-bikes are ubiquitous now. And like, what are we doing there? And at some point, it's going to take a bunch of group activist individuals who are really passionate about this to do what? Well, to get our infrastructure fixed. How do you do that? That costs money. And people have to pay from their wallets of that. And that's where I am always finding, Alex and Daniel, the disconnect. When you're asking people to pay more for something, it's really, really hard because they already feel like A, they're contributing by owning an electric car, and B, by paying their taxes, or C, like, well, that doesn't necessarily affect me. Like maybe the roads being safer, maybe it'll be helpful for my neighbor's kids, but I don't allow my kids to ride the bike because it's not safe, so I'm not going to pay anymore. So what do we do to change things when the reality is we live in a capitalistic country? There's positives, negatives with that, and more positives than negatives, in my opinion. When you want real change and things cost money, that's where the rubber meets the road with societal change. That's why I do what I do. That's why I'm a municipal finance attorney. That's why I'm an infrastructure finance attorney. I walk the walk. I take the public transit, and I also work in that space. But how can you help me and help others out there to change the way they think about paying for infrastructure or paying maybe a little bit more in a tax or a little bit more in a user fee? Like, how do we get things changed when we live in this individual society? What do we do?
One of the little conceptual things that I found really useful in writing the book and coming away with was a better understanding that like with every action you take, like if you ride your bike to work, okay, it's a little bit of a cost on you, but you're also making the world a little bit better place materially by not burning gas and taking up a parking spot and clogging up traffic. With a lot of individual actions, not even ones which are purely structurally facing, these little individual actions, there's a material benefit, maybe a little bit material cost as well. But for every one of those, there's also a kind of social signal that you're emitting as you do it. What we are all doing all the time when we're figuring out what the norms are of our society is paying attention to what other people are doing and paying really close attention to these social signals about what's normal and what isn't. This is why people can get obsessed about normalizing certain activities or don't normalize that, or we need to normalize riding your bike to work. It's just this weird feature of the human mind. Normal does not mean correct, right? Conceptually, those are not the same thing. Common doesn't mean correct, like normal doesn't mean right. But we just see the social world and interpret it. If something is normal, it just seems like the right thing to do. With every action someone is taking, they're doing the actual physical action, they're doing whatever the material outcomes of those are, they're triggering those. But they're also signaling to their neighbors and their community what's okay, what's normal, what might there be interpreted as the right thing to do. And as you're doing all of these individual actions, what you're helping to like shift the way people understand what's correct, what's normal, what they can do, the sense of possibilities. It's an important step in this whole process of building awareness and then support for the kinds of larger scale policy implementations and expenditures of taxes on things, which will like, okay, if riding my bike to work is something that a lot of people do, it's normal, I'm not going to be some eco freak if I do it. Wouldn't it be great if also there was bike lanes all the way from my house to campus? Now I'm going to be willing to stand up and maybe join with other people who have similar values, start putting pressure on local policymakers to put a line for that in the budget, right? And so I'm paying my taxes. I want them to go towards things that I care about. My identity of myself is now invested not just as someone who rides my bike to work, but who's willing to do some organizing and some political activism in the service of building infrastructure, which allows this to happen more frequently and allows other people to be pulled into the fold. So that's sort of a microcosm of the kind of thing, which I think our book is trying to build out resources to think about how that can happen on bigger scales and on multiple scales between those.
Yeah, I think I would definitely, of course, because I co-wrote the book with Dan, co-sign everything he just said. And I think specifically on the normative front, hypothetically, if Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift rode their e-bikes to Arrowhead Stadium this year, I think that sales of e-bikes would spike. And if people had them, then they would ride them and so on and so forth. I think that's a huge part of the story. So our book opens with the example of cars in the 1920s from Peter Norton's book, who I think you had on in like November, which was really cool to see. So we are kind of preoccupied with the car example. And so we also talk about if you look at photos of Amsterdam or Copenhagen in 1970, it is nothing but cars. And if you look at them now, it is nothing but bikes. And so there are proof of concept cases where what seems like incredibly dramatic change can happen. And so we take inspiration from those. But part of your question was about, the financial bottom line. And I think that's a really important part of the story. There's a lot more to say there too. So one of the people we focus on is, what's his first name? Donald Shoup. He's the anti-parking crusader, right? So there's something like 7 parking spots for every car in this country. And so for the 3 of us living in LA, you live in LA too, Rudy, right? Yeah.
I do. Yeah. I live in the South Bay, which is its own little microcosm of LA.
Right. We're just incredibly dominated by car culture. Another podcast that's not as good as yours, the Volts podcast by David Roberts, he had on politicians recently who passed laws removing requirements that new housing and buildings had to have parking spaces. That actually makes it more expensive for builders to require them to use space for parking. So if we're removing that requirement, we're making something cheaper. But then when there are fewer parking spaces, then there's less of an incentive to drive. And so if you're thinking about somewhere like New York City or San Francisco, where there's not as much parking, I mean, of course, we do want to make things easier. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. We want to make the good stuff easier, but it's also about making the bad stuff harder. So right now we have laws on the books that require you to build parking spaces. That's not a good economic thing. That's a bad economic thing. And so there are some of these cases where it's not necessarily going to be a huge drain on finances to make positive progress. And I think there's all kinds of other little things like putting up more shade at bus stops. Right. It is hot as Hades out here right now.
Okay.
And if you were going to tell me to wait, for the Silver Star or whatever, I'm going to be standing out in the 95-degree heat and I didn't bring sunscreen. It's like, no, thank you. But if there was shade, we're making that's, shade is not going to putting up a little shade is not going to break the bank. But that's something that could make the good stuff a little bit easier. Right.
And let me, since we are in Los Angeles, let me just tie something together very, very quickly here. I agree about the bus. I like using buses, and where I'm at in the South Bay, there are no shades, there are nothing. Thankfully, it's nice and cool here. However, you know what shade brings at bus stops? You know what comfortable seats bring at bus stops? The homeless. It's true. I mean, I hate to, sound like that, but it's true. I see it. I have seen it with my own eyes. They actually make bus stops a lot more uncomfortable because it has traditionally attracted that. And that's a problem. Here you cannot separate transportation from what? Affordable housing, right? You bring up parking, you bring up buildings, but everything, in my opinion, okay, and this is one of the themes of this show, everything ties to transportation. Transportation is freedom, period. Stop. End of story. If you do not have the ability to move from point A to point B, whether you're in jail or whether you're here, or whether you don't have the means or whether you have this, whether you're immobile for whatever reason, transportation is the definition of freedom. People need to start thinking about that, because in the United States, we like choices. We don't want people to tell us what to do. Well, don't you also like the ability to make other choices, right? Like you want to be forced to only use a car? Do you know why we have an obesity crisis in this country? Because there are too many damn cars, period. Stop, full stop, end of story. You want to stop obesity? It's because of our transportation options. That's what I believe. I also don't believe in aliens, and you can't convince me of that. I'm not trying to bring that in. I'm saying these are.
I was going to make a joke about that, but now it's you're anticipating.
I'll take that away. I take the sting away.
No. Yeah.
This stuff is vitally important, and what you guys are doing is really important.
They also link it in the book to race, because there's fewer less access. So in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black neighborhoods, which means that it takes so much longer to commute, which impacts how you can work and what happens with your time.
Oh yeah, a lot of those neighborhoods had freeways. The freeways decimated these neighborhoods and broke them apart, and they're disconnected, they're disjointed, and now they're the air polluted. Forget about it.
Right.
It's incredible. You cannot divorce transportation from anything, and that's why I'm passionate about this stuff. And I'm glad you guys are writing this stuff and talking about it. And that's why I didn't mean to put your feet to the fire. I was asking you because people come to me and they go, "Oh, you're so forward thinking about bonds and infrastructure finance. How can we build the things that we want? And how do we do this and how do we do that?" And I go, "Well, we need more money." Well, how do you get more money? I don't know. I'm not smart enough to figure that part out. That's why I'm asking for help from people, is how do we get people to pay more?
Sure. Right. So we definitely co-sign the idea that transportation is like such a fundamental feature of all of these other problems. But, so earlier we're talking about like, well, you might build something to make transportation easier, but then is that going to have potentially an unintended consequence? And that's another thing that we're preoccupied with in the book, is sometimes folks might be entirely well-meaning and they think they know it all and they think they know the solution to the problem, and then they put some policy in place, and then it has some unintended consequence that maybe it makes things worse than they were before, maybe it solves one problem and creates another. And so that's to go back to one of the initial questions that Gwendolyn raised, was about like everything problems. To understand all of these problems, to any of these problems, we have to understand how they're interconnected with all the others, right? If we want to solve the transportation problem, we also have to solve the affordable housing problem. We also have to solve the opioid crisis. We also have to solve the mental health crisis, right? And so that can seem really daunting because, and this is sort of part of the framing of the book, because it's like, there's this huge, massive interconnected system. What can we do? So that can seem really daunting. But on the other hand, there's a potentially positive spin on it, again, which is that what seems like a small change that you're making, a small effort that you're making, might have all these ripple effects in other systems that might possibly be positive. One way we try to square the circle when it comes to dealing with these unintended consequences is insisting on a kind of pragmatist, experimental orientation. So there's all these problems in the world. We know that there are problems. We know we have to do something. So we're not laissez-faire libertarian economists who are just like, just let it ride. We do have to get involved, but we can't assume that we know the answers, right? So we need epistemic humility. When we try out a new intervention, we have to try it out and then see how it goes and sort of be like, okay, our new policy worked or it didn't work. And then how are we going to go back to the drawing board to try to fix it? So that's definitely a fundamental feature of the orientation we have in the book.
Maybe I'll wrap up because I have so many notes. So I'm like, there's so many things I want to talk about. I'll do this. Contemporary issue that is sounding the alarm in terms of structure. It's going in a different direction than I would like to see, and a lot of people in education would like to see. But to really shed light on how powerful the structure is would be the example of the amount of books, something about 600 books that have been removed from the libraries in the state of Florida. Seeing that structural change. Now, some people are saying it's not a book ban. It's just not in the libraries. But the point is that it's also removing the choice. So something you wrote in here is that choices are shaped by social structure. And so even though it's not technically a ban, like they're not burned, they're not illegal, they're simply removed, it's removing the choice, which is then only limiting the choice and the access for the students. This would be an example of how we can see a structural change, not exactly going in the direction I want, but it's a much bigger deal to remove access to, I mean, on the list is like Toni Morrison, you've got The Diary of Anne Frank is on that list. It's just removing the access to the choice, which we're afraid is going to happen. It's going to cascade, if you will, like you said in the book, into a direction where there's there's even less empathy, less understanding of points of view, less understanding of history. And it's going to stifle a lot of communication, because I think one of the stifling effects of cutting back of reading in general, when education, like just doing excerpts instead of reading cover to cover, that we are seeing the impact of that with even like the male loneliness culture, the incel culture, and the manosphere culture. When you listen to it or look at it closely, you see that there is this absence of seeing other people as people. And so how is that happening? And I think some of it can be traced back to the removal of reading novels, and also feminizing reading novels as though that's a girl thing to do. And so then that's the worst thing that a young man could possibly participate in. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about some like contemporary structural changes that you see on the horizon you're not in favor of? Or maybe the structural changes to the CDC. Like there's so many things that are happening right now.
The one about novels and book banning is really near and dear to my heart. I was an English major, double major in college. I'm still part of multiple reading groups and everything. I see your contention that it might connect up with the manosphere culture.
Has it somehow become a chick thing, like a girl thing to read? How did that swap? Because, you know, as somebody who studies literature, you're given a list of names of male authors. There's not many women in the mix, but somehow reading and studying and listening and learning is counter to the contemporary notion of this alpha male. And I think it's because it requires a sense of humility, and that is antithetical to what it means to be in the manosphere. So somehow learning and reading fiction, for instance, has been considered useless. It's not going to make you money. It's not going to, or that's the idea. But that structural change is really scaring me, and it's catching fire.
I mean, one of the things that I sort of take maybe hope in is that like there's a Streisand effect for all these books that get banned. And a lot of them are in the public domain too. So much of that gets publicized as like, these are the books that have been banned. And then at least I know I live in my own media bubble, but the names of those books are listed everywhere and they're blasted out, and access to those books is made, like where you can get them online is made public and available. So it's another one of these places where you might think that there's a backlash, and that backlash might come in places that we don't really understand yet, because our brick and mortar libraries, I just don't know what the significance of those are for how members of the younger generation consume information, whatever information they do consume. If they're all online now and a lot of these books are online, then maybe that's something that will shape the way that this particular structural trend is moving. But I don't, again, your initial question was like, are there any other trends that we're particularly worried about right now? And the response there is going to be like, how long do you have?
I know. When I was reading your book, I'm telling you, I have so many notes. I think what we're going to do is you're going to have to come back. I don't think you have any choice. I think that's what's going to happen, because there's still a lot of discussion. Like something I saw is like seeing racism as a habit, as one of the ways to discuss it. And I thought that was really fascinating, because it was hard for me to see, because how do you know that you have the habit? But then when I do something like look at our Cal Poly orientation training that we have to do at the beginning of every semester, and there's this whole thing on like sexual harassment, and I'm watching it and I'm thinking, how do you not fucking know that? Oh, excuse me. How do you not know this stuff? The way that people are supposed to behave. And then I realize it because I'm a woman, so I'm looking at it differently. And I'm thinking, how did we get to a point where you have to teach somebody that you should not touch them? They haven't invited it or consented it. And it is the habit of seeing women as less than, as objects that's in the media space. So as a woman, I'm able to see it. It seems more obvious to me. But because I'm white, I don't see the obviousness of the habit of racism. So that's what I was like, oh, okay, we have to come back and talk about that, because I would like to know more about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, would love that. Yeah. And it's like you could have, for example, like a white woman who, if someone just walks up and touches their pregnant baby bump, they would be like, how dare you enter my personal space and, just assume you can touch me. But then they turn around and ask a black woman if they can touch her hair.
Yeah.
Right? These habits are, you could be sensitive to them in some ways and then clueless about them in others. And again, I mean, this is another area where, in my own personal growth on this, there are philosophers like Helen Go who have written on the idea of racism as a habit. And she's drawn on folks like, I think John Dewey but also Frantz Fanon and, all these folks. And so that has been, was a really influential piece of my own development, was thinking about the phenomenology of these racist habits.
All right. We'll come back and do that. Alex and Dan, thank you so much. Thank you for this. I'm excited for your book. I'm excited, when you have the students, when we have our book club, I'm excited to see the reception of it. And I think another thing I really like at the book is that I guess I expected a really like a dense academic book. So I didn't realize that this was something that is for everybody. That it's just broken down and nice, accessible and smart. Because I think we need more literature out there where there's, we have this distance between the ivory tower and everybody else, basically. And so I like it when you deliberately put in this effort to make it thoughtful, not using esoteric language. It's an inviting book. Let me put it that way. It's an inviting book. Thank you.
I really appreciate that. Yeah.
That's great. Seriously, on the side, I'd love to figure out how I could work with you guys in any way, shape, or form or promote anything, because we're all simpatico.
Yeah. And I did want to say, of all the podcasts I listen to that is co-hosted by a philosopher and a lawyer, nonfiction writer, fiction writer, actor, stand-up comedian who campaigns against cars and against the existence of aliens, this is my favorite one. So
wow, I appreciate that.
Very happy.
We are in a group of one or a half of one. I don't even know what we are in, but I'll take it, man. I appreciate it very much.
Thanks so much, Rudy. It's been great.
Good is in the Details is produced by Dr. Gwendolyn Dolske and Rudy Salo. If you're enjoying this episode, take a screenshot, share it, tag us on Instagram, Good is in the Details Pod. We also love those 5-star reviews. Be sure to check out our Patreon for extra content and check out the show notes so that you can get a copy of Somebody Should Do Something. I also linked Alex's op-ed piece in the New York Times. If you'd like to get in touch, goodisinthedetailspod@gmail.com. Pitch an idea or join us in our programming. Sponsor an episode. We love to promote your business. Okay, until next time.